What if I told you that one Christmas morning in the heart of ancient Rome, a kneeling warrior king was suddenly declared emperor without his consent? One moment he's deep in prayer, the next a golden crown rests on his head and the future of Europe is forever changed. Was it divine destiny or a calculated political ambush? This is the true story behind the rise of Charlemagne. It's the year 800 AD. We stand in the dim, sacred light of old St. Peter's Basilica, not the towering Renaissance church most tourists know today, but its predecessor, a place built centuries earlier over the bones of martyrs. Beneath these stones lie the remains of early Christians who were crucified, persecuted, and buried during the darkest days of Roman paganism. Here, amid incense and chant, Pope Leo III moves toward Charlemagne, king of the Franks, who kneels in solemn devotion. And then, with deliberate grace, the Pope places a golden crown upon his head and declares him Emperor of the Romans. Charlemagne is stunned. He hadn't asked for this. No ceremony had been rehearsed, and yet in an instant he becomes the most powerful man in the West. What just happened? This moment was more than a religious gesture. It was a bold, almost rebellious political statement. For centuries, the only legitimate Roman emperor ruled far to the east in Constantinople. But now a Germanic king was being crowned as if he alone carried the Roman legacy forward. For many in the Byzantine Empire this was blasphemy, an insult, but for the West it was salvation. Rome, once fallen, was rising again, not with marble but with muscle, might, and faith. The Pope, struggling against chaos in Italy, saw Charlemagne as his last hope. The city of Rome had become a battleground not of foreign armies, but of internal power struggles. Local noble families ran the city like rival mafia clans, treating the papacy like a pawn. By crowning Charlemagne, Pope Leo III wasn't just honoring a king, he was placing the church above all kings. The crown was not just a gift, it was leverage. For Charlemagne, this coronation was the birth of a paradox. He would rule as both protector of the church and servant of its authority, and from this tension the Holy Roman Empire was born, an empire that would shape Europe for the next 1,000 years. When Charlemagne took the throne, he didn't inherit peace. He inherited a powder keg. Pagan tribes to the north, rebellious nobles to the east, and a crumbling Roman legacy at his feet. But within decades he would unite nearly all of Western Europe, not through luck but with fire, steel, and relentless purpose. What kind of king builds an empire by breaking the unbreakable? Charlemagne was not the architect of an empire from scratch. He was the heir to a storm. His grandfather, Charles Martel, had stopped the Muslim advance at Tours. His father, Pepin the Short, had established the Carolingian dynasty, but the lands they passed on, Aquitaine, Burgundy, and parts of modern France and Germany, were fragile, fragmented, and still surrounded by dangerous enemies. Charlemagne understood something his predecessors didn't. Power was not just about how much land you held, it was about how deeply your rule was felt. His genius lay not in seizing new territory, but in mastering the land others failed to tame. He began with the Lombards in northern Italy. They had once been allies, but now posed a threat to papal authority. In 774, Charlemagne crossed the Alps in a brutal winter campaign, surrounded the city of Pavia, and brought the kingdom of Lombardy to its knees. Their king was dethroned. Their crown, the Iron Crown of Lombardy, was placed on Charlemagne's head. Next came Bavaria, proud and defiant. Charlemagne's campaign here was a masterpiece of calculated dominance. He mixed force with diplomacy, offering vassalage in exchange for peace. Resistance was crushed with precision, and Bavaria was absorbed into his growing empire. But his most ferocious challenge was the Saxon Wars, a 30-year struggle against fierce pagan tribes in northern Germany. The Saxons refused to convert. They fought guerrilla-style battles in forests and marshes. For every village Charlemagne conquered, the Saxons burned another in revenge. In response, Charlemagne didn't flinch. He built fortified garrisons, staged winter campaigns, and implemented one of the harshest policies of his reign: forced baptisms and brutal punishment for rebellion. One infamous act was the massacre of Verdun in 782, where 400-500 Saxon prisoners were executed after a revolt. Modern historians debate the context and scale, but the message was clear: resistance would be crushed completely. Yet even this ruthlessness wasn't random. Charlemagne saw religion as a weapon and conversion as conquest. To rule the land, he had to conquer the soul. But Charlemagne wasn't all blood and iron. He knew that borders were fragile without strong frontiers, so he created what he called the marches, buffer zones along the edges of his empire. These were militarized border regions governed by loyal warlords. One march was built in the south to monitor Muslim Spain, while others in the east kept watch over the Slavs and Avars. By the time the dust settled, Charlemagne controlled territory from the Pyrenees in the west to the Elbe River in the east, over 800 miles wide. It was the most extensive dominion in Europe since the fall of Rome. What happens when a warrior king who can barely write decides to rule an empire through law and learning? You'd expect failure. But Charlemagne turned that weakness into a revolution, not with swords this time, but with scrolls, scholars, and schools. In a time when few could even sign their name, he dreamed of building a literate empire. This wasn't just conquest, this was transformation. Charlemagne's reputation as a military genius is undeniable. But what truly separated him from the countless warlords of medieval Europe wasn't how he won, it was how he ruled. After decades of conquest, Charlemagne faced a new challenge: governance. His empire stretched across hundreds of miles and dozens of cultures. Chaos wasn't just possible, it was inevitable unless he could find a way to make his presence felt in places he couldn't physically be. So he turned to an ancient idea: centralization. Charlemagne's royal court in Aachen became the heart of his empire, a nerve center, where administration, diplomacy, and scholarship converged. From here he issued decrees, received envoys, and built a government that could project power without constant bloodshed. One of his most radical ideas was the use of missi dominicae, traveling royal inspectors, often in pairs of one noble and one bishop, sent across the empire to ensure justice, enforce royal policies, and report abuses. It was a medieval version of federal oversight, revolutionary for its time. But Charlemagne's reforms weren't limited to law. He knew that ruling an empire of illiterates was a recipe for collapse, so he launched one of the most ambitious education campaigns in European history. At the palace school in Aachen, he gathered the brightest minds of his time: priests, monks, and foreign scholars, including Alcuin of York, a Northumbrian intellectual who had been shaping English monastic education before Charlemagne invited him to court. Their mission: to teach reading, writing, Latin, and Christian doctrine not just to clerics, but to future administrators, nobles, and even the children of Charlemagne himself. And Charlemagne led by example. Despite being illiterate most of his life, he attempted to learn how to write, practicing on wax tablets at night. His own struggles with literacy became symbolic: if the emperor tried, everyone else had no excuse. Through these efforts, a powerful message spread: learning was no longer a luxury for monks. It was a duty of leadership. He also initiated reforms in economic policy. As gold became scarce, he restructured the currency system to rely more on silver, making trade and tax collection more consistent. He demanded that landowners register their properties and wealth, allowing for better taxation and accountability, rudimentary but effective steps toward bureaucratic rule. By standardizing laws, taxes, scripts, and even weights and measures, Charlemagne made his empire more than just a patchwork of conquered lands. He made it governable, and through the written word he gave it memory, something no sword could provide. What do you leave behind when you've conquered half of Europe, reformed the church, and sparked a cultural revolution? But your sons can't hold it together. Charlemagne's legacy was too big for one man and too heavy for his heirs. His death didn't just mark the end of a reign, it began a slow unraveling of everything he built. But sometimes an idea survives even when the empire does not. Charlemagne died in 814, seated in his palace at Aachen, likely unaware of how fragile his empire truly was. For decades he had ruled a domain that stretched from the Atlantic to the Danube, from the North Sea to the Mediterranean. But empires built on the shoulders of a single giant rarely survive the weight of succession. Before his death, Charlemagne attempted to divide his empire among his sons, a practice not uncommon in Frankish tradition. His original plan was for 3 heirs each to rule a part of the realm, but fate had other ideas. 2 of his sons died before him. Only Louis the Pious, his youngest surviving son, was left. And so in 813, Charlemagne crowned Louis as co-emperor, a quiet ceremony with none of the drama of his own coronation decades earlier. Louis inherited the crown but not the command. Where Charlemagne had ruled with boldness and control, Louis leaned more toward piety than politics. His reign was marked by internal strife, not expansion. He faced rebellions from his own sons and nobles who sensed weakness. and so began the splintering. In 843, just one generation after Charlemagne's death, his grandsons agreed to the Treaty of Verdun, a formal division of the empire, into 3 parts. Lothair received the central portion, including northern Italy and parts of modern-day Netherlands and Burgundy. Louis the German took the eastern lands, the seeds of what would later become Germany. Charles the Bald ruled the western lands territory that would one day evolve into France. This division created borders and tensions that would persist for centuries. But even as the empire fractured, the idea of what Charlemagne had created remained alive. The title of Holy Roman Emperor, born on Christmas Day in 800, outlived his dynasty. In 962, nearly 150 years later, a new king, Otto I of Germany, was crowned with the same title, reviving the imperial ideal and tying it once more to both throne and altar. Charlemagne had become more than a man. He was now a symbol. His name, Carolus Magnus or Charles the Great, echoed through cathedrals, courtrooms, and chronicles. He was remembered not just for battles, but for books. Not just for crowns, but for culture. His capital at Aachen, though no longer imperial, remained a sacred site home to his marble throne, his burial chapel, and countless legends about a king who never truly died, only slumbered, awaiting a day when Christendom would need him again. And in truth, Europe would invoke his name over and over again. Napoleon styled himself as his successor. Hitler traced an imagined lineage to him. The European Union would later name a unification prize in his honor, the Charlemagne Prize, given to those who help unify Europe through peace, not war. His empire had faded, but his idea had not. Charlemagne showed that leadership isn't about perfection. It's about direction. That even in an age of swords and shadows, one ruler could wield the pen, the cross, and the crown to reshape a continent. And for that, history remembers him not just as a king, but as the father of Europe.